You might think you know your panelists, but I'll bet you didn't know that one of our panelists worked in a factory making sporting goods to earn money to go to college. That's right, Dr. Eleanor Sterling adds seamstress to her CV. Welcome, Eleanor. Another one of our panelists was forced to take an ecology class during college, and he said, I quote, I hated it. Can you believe that this came out of Dr. Shahid Naeem's mouth? I can't either, but welcome, Shahid. Now we're down to the final two. You heard one of these two fine gentlemen sing at the holiday party. And he says he considered a career in music before he decided that it was easier to be a scientist with a music hobby rather than a musician with a science hobby. So, Dr. Matthew Palmer, we're glad you chose music as a hobby. Welcome, Matthew. So last but not least, Dr. Don Melnick. He says he was an incredibly shy child who spent most of his time in the forest just 50 meters from his home. But who else could get students so engaged and make you laugh during a lecture about evolution? So thank you for being here, Don.
And describe your work, how you fit into the scientific, how you see yourself fitting into the scientific community, and then end with what making an impact with your science means to you.
Oh, okay. Well, since I'm shy, I can't pass it on. It's really true. I didn't speak to many people for about the first 10 years of my life. So I guess I would say I divide my science career into three parts. The only problem is I've never left one behind, so they just keep accumulating. My early scientific career, now started 45 years ago, was laboratory genetics on wildlife species, on wild species, not on model species. And I've continued to do that. Population and evolution genetics right up to this very day. The second part of what I did was to see whether some of what I was doing and what I knew could be applied to issues of conservation of endangered species. So I then began to try to integrate genetics with conservation management. This was in the early days before there was such a field as conservation genetics, and now it's become a field. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it has become a field. So that's sort of the second thing I do, is sort of, you might call applied science rather than basic science. And the third is just integration of science into discussions about policy and the development of policy, whether it's local or national or even international. And so I've worked at all of those levels. Mostly helping to train scientists in other countries so that they can then bring the information that's gained from doing that scientific work to their governments, or again at all different levels. But I've also worked on the international level, at the level of the United Nations, and which is, was an interesting experience, but not necessarily one I want to repeat. But it actually was very instructive about how important science can be and often how utterly irrelevant it can be to discussions that go on. What was the second thing?
How do you define making an impact with your science?
How do I define making an impact with my science? Well, I think you can make impacts in many different ways, but I would also argue that if you, your science itself can actually make an impact through people reading it and citing it and trying to build on it. So in that way, your science can be very important. You can try to make an effort to bring your science to larger audiences, whether they are school children or lifelong learners, or take it to forums that generally science is not found in, and having discussions like that. So I've done a lot of that, and you can do it through writing. I've written a number of op-ed pieces for the New York Times and other kinds of pieces that have gone out to the general public audience, and I've sat for interviews with CBS and NPR and PBS and all of those. That's another way in which you can do it. It's hard to measure that impact. There are some ways in which people have tried to see. It's hard to measure. I sort of see us as all sort of flailing around and hoping that some things rise to the surface through all of that flailing. But you can have, really direct impacted discussions if you are involved in those kinds of discussions. And I have been in the past. They can be very frustrating, but as I said, it isn't, the arguments don't, we have this notion, and then I'll shut up. We have this notion that if I just bring the facts to you, of course you will understand. Okay. And that's just not true. That's an unbelievably naive notion. It's the kind of thing, the currency that we all trade in here, but it's not what the larger world trades in. So it isn't just, I will bring you the scientific facts, and that will be it. My argument will win the day, and I will walk out victorious. That just doesn't turn out to be true. And we can have a discussion about that as the session goes on.
Whoever feels like going next.
Just go down the line.
Why not?
But then when you get to you,
I wonder if anything to say.
So I guess to say what it is I'm doing, I would like to point out that I feel I have to rise to the level that Eleanor did. And I was a travel agent and inventory controller, and I worked at the U.S. Mint, where they make money, which is not what you do when you're an academic. But then and this question about impact, I think when I worked in the working world with working people, it seemed to me that that was a place that you could have a lot of impact, because you get to know many people who are voting and thinking, and their families, and it was a very large circle. And I think I was assistant supervisor. I was an inventory controller at Strauss & Giroux, and had 10 people working under me, so it's kind of like a lab, I suppose. So I guess it's sort of following on Don's question, what is it you mean by an impact, and what is it you hope to achieve? I feel now that my conversations are with people like you or others. Many times I feel like we're all thinking quite similarly in what it is we'd like to achieve, and that wasn't true when I was in the working world. I reached a much greater diversity of people than here. But my work concerns the environmental consequences of biodiversity loss, and I'll leave it at that. So another way to look at it is I don't have any focus at all. But my job as a professor is to make sure that every one of my students is extremely focused in what they want to do. So in a way, what I do is actually what my lab does. You can go to our lab site, which I share with Matt. It's called Ecology with No Apology, and get a sense of what it is we do. I often say that we're looking at the relationship of ecosystem function to biodiversity, and then quickly point out that neither biodiversity or ecosystem function is easy to describe, and like plotting one enigmatic thing against another enigmatic thing. So getting back to impact, I felt, as I said, when I was younger, that to do things like become a great writer or a great artist or a musician or something like that, which I tried in all of those, somehow science was a lot easier. I tell that to students in the humanities, that I found science easier than the humanities, and they can't believe that's true, but it is actually true. And I thought that was the greatest way to reach out and connect with other people through art. Then I sort of discovered science as another way of doing that. My work, quite by accident, about biodiversity became very well known and was cited a lot. I think one of my early papers was one of the 5th most cited papers in global change research or something like that. And I suddenly got called on to go, speak here and testify there and work on this committee and co-author some report. And I realized that just by doing the science that I loved, people then sort of found me. And if you were willing, they would really make use of your time. So I'm part of this thing called the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program, which is like Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, a really unnecessarily long name. But that exposes scientists who are interested, once you've gotten tenure, they try to make sure that your job is protected before you start doing this, to learn how to work with the press, to speak publicly, to write op-ed pieces. You go to Washington, D.C. and interface with Congress and meet NGOs and things like that. And my takeaway message was that communication is great, but it's very difficult. And don't do it unless you're prepared to put a lot of time and effort in crafting your message really well. One of the take-home messages I got is if the New York Times calls up and you're busy, hang up. If they call and say, would you like to come and testify about signing the CBD, the U.S. signing it to Congress like tomorrow? Just say no unless you're really ready to do this, because you could screw up badly. And then finally, and I'm taking a long time, I actually discovered a little while back, a few years ago, that I think the greatest impact you could have, and I don't mean to say this just because it's what I do, is through interacting with students and to teaching. Because your impact has a number of components. One is that it can be immediate, short-term, and powerful, or it can have longevity and durability. And that's what happens when you do teaching. I actually feel that my graduate students and the undergraduates I teach are the ones who are, sort of like amplifying the ability to have an impact and make the world a better place. And I'll turn it over to this master teacher.
Thank you, Shahid. So going third in the line means a lot of things you wanted to say have already been said. But I'll start at the beginning of your set of questions, which to explain a little bit about who I am. I am a senior lecturer here in E3B rather than a tenure track research scientist, and so I spend more of my time teaching and advising. I'm the director of the undergraduate program in environmental biology, and we have a post-baccalaureate program. So I spend a lot of time on the teaching and advising side, but I do have a research portfolio. One of the fun things about being an academic researcher is you sort of get to define who you are, and you can define yourself differently for different audiences. So by sort of systems, I usually study either urban ecosystems or forests or wetlands. That's a lot, but I'm on the terrestrial end rather than the aquatic end. By organismal systems, I work mostly on plants, but I've also done some work on insects and amphibians and reptiles. And in terms of organizational systems, I focus mostly on population and community ecology, sometimes grading into ecosystem ecology, but rarely down into the sort of inside the skin level. So that's a range of the work that I do. And in terms of impact, because Shahid said it most recently, I think that one of the major ways to have impact is through teaching and advising. Now that's obviously if you're in a position where you are a teacher. That doesn't have to be at an academic institution. That can be through informal science education, that can be in public education, that can be in, we need great science teachers at all stages of life. And one thing perhaps you don't realize is the majority of people teaching science to the youngest members of this society generally don't have much experience in society, don't have much experience in science. They haven't practiced as scientists, they haven't taken many science classes. So you realize we have a lot of generally trained educators, and so and that ramifies itself in people's attitudes towards science and perceived abilities in science, and that leads partly to the challenges we have about conveying. When we think, and I think Don is exactly right, you can't just provide the data and expect it to speak for itself, because a lot of people don't have the skills to understand it or aren't ready to receive it, and that has to do more broadly with public education. So that's I think absolutely true in teaching, that a big part of your impact is on the abilities of the people you've taught. Certainly from a perspective of advising undergraduate and graduate research, the same sort of thing. We teach a set of approaches to science and skills and the like, and those go out and produce additional work. You realize at a certain point, I think in your academic career certainly, when we say our work, it's mostly the work done by our students. Most of us are not at a lab bench or spending much time actually collecting raw data in the field anymore. And so that is, that's just part of the way this progresses. The other piece about impact is, and I might disagree with Shahid a little bit about, just hang up the phone on the New York Times, because if you hang up the phone too many times or you say no too many times, eventually people stop asking. And that closes some door to some forms of impact. I think you do want to be careful what you say on the record. I do know this is being videotaped, but particularly on the record with journalists and things that we get out there, you don't want to, the Hippocratic Oath is, first do no harm, right? We don't want to make the situation worse. But on the other hand, if you don't engage, and whether that's with the media or whether that's with the policy process, then some of the best ideas or most knowledgeable people or the relevant expertise doesn't get out there. The question is how to decide when to say yes. If you know something and you don't have to spend a lot of time, if your expertise can contribute it. If it's something outside your realm of expertise, decide it's not that important to see your name in the paper if you can't actually advance the debate. But besides the media piece, there's also people will ask you for things once they know that you have some expertise and some knowledge, and different communities will want the input of smart, educated people. And so deciding which of those invitations to say yes to is important. I was, I think, partly invited onto the panel because I do a lot of work here in New York City. So I've worked a lot with city council and city agencies and with the state and federal agencies that are working within the boundaries of New York City. And this has expanded out to being working with all kinds of partners, both the Parks Department, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Education. There's this huge bureaucracy of how we run things. We run the schools, we run the parks, we run the transportation network. And all of those public agencies sometimes require expert guidance in science. They sometimes have scientists on staff, but sometimes they rely on outside experts to help improve the way the city functions or the way that we live here in the city. And so I've pursued that, and it's been beneficial for me and for my students. Many former students from E3B are now working in these agencies, and they've got good jobs and are contributing good science to the management of this place where we live and work. And that only came about from answering calls or agreeing to be a technical reviewer on a report or participating in a panel. And then you end up on advisory boards, and then you end up sort of connected to this sort of science policy infrastructure. The policymakers largely are not experts in science, and so they need that input from somewhere. And with everything, it's a question of how much time you want to put into it, and how much you can justify carving out hours in the week to do those things. But I do think that's another piece of the impact by answering the call for your expertise, because in some ways that's what makes the on-the-ground action. You've got people that are going to spend money to put plants in the ground, or going to spend money to restore a coastal marsh, and they want to do it right. And so if you have expertise that can help them to do it more effectively, that's a way to leverage impact as well. It's also hard to measure the metrics of those things, but think about it this way: if you didn't answer the call, who would? And would that person have as much to contribute as you can? I taught the undergraduate, or co-taught the undergraduate conservation biology course for several years. And one of the parting messages we'd always give in that last class was, don't underestimate your expertise. And we were talking to the undergraduate audience, and this is, I think, mostly a graduate student audience. But in almost every sphere outside this room, you are going to be the most expert in your field. And you should not undersell yourself when you might think, I don't really know that much about that topic. If you know enough to help guide even a local decision, wherever you end up living, there will be people who care about managing the environment in that place. And you know a lot about the environment. And so to the extent that you want to have, even if you are doing completely pure research or it seems esoteric and you wonder how am I actually impacting life on the ground, get out there and meet the people who are doing the projects on the ground. and help them do their jobs better. So that can be volunteering on your local environmental commission or an advisory board for a local nonprofit. People will want your expertise. And again, recognize if you're not providing it, that's limiting the impact you could have.
So there's a lot of commonalities across the panel, and even more than you might expect, because when I first started my education career in undergraduate, I was actually a comparative linguist. And I was dragging my feet across campus, and I really did not want to have to take the distribution requirement in the sciences. I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? And a friend of mine said, I'm going to this class, it's amazing, you got to come. And I went to the class. It was a class on, it was an anthropology class, in physical anthropology. And I took the class and I loved it. And my TA was Don Melnick. More connections than you ever expected in this. And he sort of really shifted my major and ended up becoming a major in biology and psychology.
I should just break in and say, for years I've been pleading with Eleanor not to tell me how it was with music.
I love that class. It was really inspirational, and I learned a ton. And so, but I was always, as with the people in the physical anthropology class, I was always a broad thinker and connecting across differences, across various fields and subfields and things like that. So I did an undergraduate degree in psychology and biology, and then I did some work on conservation genetics with baboons, and then decided to work in a not-for-profit. So I worked in the World Wildlife Fund for a long time. And I kept writing that the ii was the most endangered primate in the world and that no one had really studied it. And I finally was like, someone should study this animal. And ended up going back to do work in anthropology and forestry and environmental studies. And again, looking across pretty disparate, at that point in time, disciplines that didn't really agree with each other, even in terms of what was an important way to decide whether you knew your field in terms of the qualifying exams. I'd say qualified in both departments. Because they didn't trust the other department's methods. And it was really exciting for me, though, to be able to be in those interstices and see those links and understand those links. And it really, I think, reinforces something everybody's been saying, which is that science is hugely important, and knowledge and depth in the science is critical, but understanding the context for when the data that comes out of science is useful or not is as important as having precision in your data. I could go on about my professional career, but in turning to thinking about impact, I think one of the most important things I've learned over the course of my career as a scientist is that you need to listen to the people you're working with and understand where they think the science is useful and not useful, and you need to push sometimes. They might not think that the science is useful, but you might be able to convince them that it's useful, but you also need to understand how that science fits in the context. I started something with a former professor from here at E3B, his name is James Gibbs. We started something called the Network of Conservation Educators and Practitioners. And we brought together all these scientists around bringing training materials to the classroom that relies on data and experiences from people on the ground. So it's really trying to find a way to make sure that the science that you're creating has an impact, or if you're a person on the ground who's trying to make decisions, you're feeding into the kind of training that happens at the university. And one of the most phenomenal experiences I had was working with this National Science Foundation funded group of people who were looking at the Colorado River. And they were trying to understand where all the drafts from the river were going and what was happening and who needed it. And we ended up developing this incredibly rich set of modules around the agriculture industry, the development and real estate industry, and how they all wanted water from this one river. And then at the end of the river, of course, is the Vaquita and the Delta. And we had this really sophisticated set of information that we all put it together in this one model. And then the politicians came in and they said, you know, everything you've done is beautiful, but it's completely irrelevant because of the legal and social norms around water and the right to water. The most important thing, if you want water at the end of the Colorado, you should turn on the water in every house in Tucson and leave it running. And then you can't build more more development further away that'll redirect the water away and stop it from going down to because the Tucson water would go down the drain and then get redirected back into the Colorado. Whereas further away, it would get directed somewhere else, it would evaporate and show up in some other water system. So all of the data that we pulled together about, this and that and this whatever, it was completely superseded by the political context and the values of the people for my right to have water in this particular area. So really important understanding. It's not that the science is bad, it's not that you don't need it, but it needs to be understood in a particular context. So at the American Museum of Natural History, so I moonlight at Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology as a core affiliate. my name changes frequently. And my daytime job, my paid job is at the American Museum of Natural History, and at the Center for Biodiversity where I work, we basically say that every piece of research that we do has to have a practical application on the ground, or we don't do it. And so whenever we're approached by somebody saying, wouldn't it be interesting if you worked with us on this, we say, great, sounds interesting, but who's going to use that? How are they going to use it? How is our contribution going to make a difference towards action? And it's hard to do. But it is something that we think about. So for us, the impact is, do the people we work with, make better decisions? Is their engagement better informed because of working with us? So we talk about informed engagement and not advocacy.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. Now I know a lot of you were all invited here because science communication is something that you practice and something that you put into your careers. But I'm going to ask you a question that we asked earlier before you came here, which has to do with the role of a scientist in communicating their science past maybe academic publishing. And I want to read you a clip out of an article that was recently published. There are several articles that have been published recently about scientists or people encouraging scientists to speak directly to the public, or to have universities encouraging scientists to speak out about public issues. And so in one quote, Jonathan Foley stated in an online essay, "Science communication is a, quote, moral imperative. Many scientists view science communication, outreach, and engagement with disinterest, disdain, or even contempt." He adds that a scientist's job is not to, quote, crank out obscure academic publications by the dozens and amass a long list of pure citations. As scientists, your real job should be to make great discoveries and share them with the world. Now, many people agree with this, and many people don't agree with this. And I know that there's some different opinions across this panel. And so the way that we asked the panelists this question was, to what degree do you agree or disagree with the following statements? Number one, is a scientist's responsibility to make an impact with their research beyond academic publishing. And number two, I think, which is most important to this audience here, it is a graduate student's responsibility to make an impact with their research beyond academic publishing. Whoever.
I might have had an outlier. I do not think that all scientists should have an impact with their work. I feel that scientists should be free to do whatever makes their hearts sing, and they should do that well, and they should contribute in their own way, in their own definition. I don't think that no scientist should have a foot in the door of understanding how there should be impact, but I don't think it should be a prerequisite that for you to do science, you need to show how it's good to society. You don't know what you're doing now and how what you're doing now could ultimately contribute to something else. I learned about this woman, Gwen West, if I understand correctly what her name is, who was doing a lot of theoretical work in the 1940s. She's a Black American woman who eventually, the work that she did got converted into developing the GPS. At the time, she was not planning to develop a GPS. At the time, she was doing sophisticated math work. And it ultimately became pretty excited that she did that work, because it helps me a lot having that GPS out there. She, in fact, I love this, she doesn't use GPS because she'd rather just do the calculations herself if she needs to go somewhere. But anyways, you should check her out. So I don't think that scientists need to or are obligated to have an impact in the general public and in the general world. Secondly, I think graduate students should learn to do research really well and actually not get distracted by how to apply it. I feel like a lot of graduate students focus so far into what is the meaning of this? How can I help? How can I fix? When they may not actually have the experience they need to really apply that information, the context, to the best of their, and some of the students in the room have heard this from me when they're trying really hard to have an impact with the work, which I admire. I think that's great, but there might be things that you need to do to focus in on in order to do a thesis that miss out on another piece of the equation that, in a systems perspective, would help you to make a better decision. So I think we should all be systems thinkers, but I think we may not, as graduate students, they may not have the ultimate context to really solve a problem. So I don't think that the students should feel pressure for that.
I would agree totally with what you're saying. First of all, responsibility, which I think was in that question, sounds like an obligation, right? And I don't think that anyone is obligated to take whatever they're doing and bring it to a larger audience. I don't think there's a standing obligation for doing that. Nor do I believe that everyone is going to be good at doing that. And so they may not actually be very good at communicating what they've done to a larger audience, or be able to interact because, as Shahid was saying, you want to make sure you don't make mistakes. It takes a lot of experience not to make a mistake in an interview when you're being pushed really hard in an interview. And then you really regret it afterwards, that you said something that you didn't think through clearly before you said it. So there are many scientists that I have known that are exceptional scientists, and the last thing I would ever want to do is put them in front of a camera. Absolutely not want to put them in front of a camera. And that's fine. I mean, they chose that monastic life because they wanted to be in the lab or the field or whatever it is and spend all their time doing that and writing their papers, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. You can do that as long as you're not hurting anyone. So that's fine. The other thing I would say, and I don't mean to insult the group of students here who are here, is to try to sort of kickstart that as a graduate student, I think is an incredibly risky proposition, and I don't think is a terribly effective one. You really don't have standing in the field as a platform for advocating much. If you want to become an advocate and join an advocacy organization, that's fine. But if you want to do it as a scientist, you need to have a much stronger platform below you to do that. I'll just end because we're actually going around talking about the jobs we had just to get through college. So I worked as a construction worker here in New York City on high-rise buildings. Open platforms, 40 stories, 45 stories up. That's what I did. You get paid a lot if you're willing to go out and do that. You might go off the edge of the building, but you actually do get paid a lot. And I actually worked on a building, several buildings in Independence Plaza that went up the same time as the World Trade Center. So I would watch that building going up as people there would watch our buildings going up. And I'll tell you, if you want to know where the rubber hits the road, it's doing construction in New York City, surrounded by a lot of construction workers. Defending your opinions, and this was a time during the Vietnam War, defending unpopular opinions with construction workers. You really have to figure out what you're going to say well before you say it.
I wanted to touch on, we didn't get, I'm feeling you're not getting the great, you need somebody to volunteer to be like absolutely counter to what we're saying. It'll have to be you, Matt.
Last to respond.
But I had a question, Ruth, who's a member of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program as well, we've had this discussion before, and it touches upon this this longer statement, especially by John Foley. I mean, I think we all agree that there isn't a moral imperative for scientists, and I think we all agree that, especially early on, that if you want to get a voice or an opportunity to participate in having an impact, that prove yourself a good scientist. And actually, what will happen is you'll have to say, "I'm sorry, I have too many commitments." That's actually what will happen once you have the credentials that you need. So as Don said, your platform right now is fairly limited. Might as well get a really good platform before you jump on it and start doing work. But there's this question about whether or not your work should be driven by utility or actually have some purpose to it. And, I just came from a tenure review committee, and I have to say that academics, they sometimes feel that if you feel or if you're being driven by some application or some purpose or you want to solve some problem, that, it's fine if you're in engineering or medical science, but it's not in arts and sciences. And that, in fact, your brilliance could be diluted or even corrupted by being distracted by the urgency of a particular problem. So then along comes this thing called sustainability science, which is, we actually have a professor of sustainability science, so ask her what that means.
I'm dying.
But what I think is really interesting about this new sort of idea of discipline science is that, when you think about it, there are a million things you could do as a scientist. All of them are equally interesting, challenging, desperately in need of dedication and long and hard times thinking about how to solve the problem. Some of them, perhaps just randomly, might actually have incredible utility to them, right? Making the world a better place, conservation, improving food, energy, water security, things like that. Other problems of absolutely the same intellectual demand may actually have no visible utility now, but might a long, long time from now. So what would be wrong with saying, well, I'm going to go over here to this one because it's just as interesting as trying to simultaneously solve linear differential equations and then work on the Jacobian matrix to see if a multi-species community is stable or not, or to figure out how I might try to deal with the challenges of the incredible complexity of food systems and how to make them resilient to climate change. They might be exactly the same intellectual challenge, requiring exactly the same, maybe even, maybe more on the applied end. But yet, in arts and sciences, they would say, oh, you're being seduced by the urgency of this need, and you'll be doing science that will be ephemeral, only solve the problem now, but not be useful as conditions change. And you'll miss opportunities to find something that abstract science stumbles upon. So I was sort of curious, all of you are graduate students looking to be scientists. Can I ask them questions? So, so what do you think about this idea of sustainability science as arguing that science is science? If it has a utility to it, that doesn't change its merit or its value in one way or another, versus arts and sciences, right? And in fact, I just came, hence the tie. Actually, the tie's for you. From a tenure review committee between 11 and 12:30. Hour and a half. This poor person's life is coming up for an hour and a half worth of discussion, right? And the fact that there were 4 bodies at work this person did is completely confidential. I'm not sure I'm even supposed to be telling you that I did this, right? But it's but there's no name. But the one of the 4 bodies of work was an application, and that was immediately seen as kind of like a liability almost, like maybe not worth as much as the other 3 things which were purely abstract. So what do you think? Now, those of you who know me, I love abstract science. The more abstract, the better, right? But I'm curious, because I get the feeling that the world has changed, and probably every one of you in this room is thinking that applied issues in science is actually the way to go. Any volunteers?
Well, so I kind of agree with what Eleanor was saying before. Scientists should do what makes their heart sing. And if the different properties of a frog's skin is what you want to do for the rest of your life, that's what you should do. And serendipitous sort of findings might make that really useful in the world, or may not. But there might be, I think there is a space also for people who find the more application science interesting. I think that's where I would start thinking about. Like, if you're interested in trying to solve the puzzle of food security and things, then go do that. And if that results in outcome, great. But I don't really think of science as starting from like, we want this outcome, how do we make it happen? Versus, this is what really interests me, so I'm going to study it the best I can. And yay, we have an outcome, maybe now, maybe 10 years from now. I think there is also a role for that, where you have an outcome and you work towards it, but I'm not so sure as a graduate student I think of that process quite as much. Maybe someone in an advocacy group or someone who's the technical side of an NGO might work like that and use the same skills that I use in my work, but learning to do science, I think, is this way enough. At least for me, it's been this way.
Personally, I started out doing fieldwork in more behavioral evolutionary science, which always really interested me, but I always wanted to have some sort of application of the science, and I think that's kind of going with Amrita was saying, it's kind of driven by curiosity. So my curiosity was driven by how can this really amazing, how can these things that I'm finding out be applied to help save the ecosystems that I see around me? So maybe it's also dependent on your goal. So if your goal is to be in academia, then perhaps what you're saying is true. Maybe we should be focusing on more abstract and more long-lasting science. But I think it depends on your interests as well.
I think it's really hard to, as graduate student, at least just in my limited experience as a graduate student on the first year, when we're applying to grants and applying to programs that ask for broader impacts and ask for justifications. I mean, I study a very, very specific host parasite system that not a lot of people care about unless they study bats or bat parasites, and it's hard to kind of, I guess, appeal to a wider audience, and you constantly, like I constantly have that pressure of, you know, either tying in a disease ecology aspect and tying in, you know, a conservation aspect, as opposed to just doing the science for the sake of the science, which I have originally been driven by, but you know, going forward in my career, it's hard to, like, I reach obstacles in that, especially from grants.
It's really important. You know, one thing I want to say is that it's not that graduate students can't contribute to change, it's just that they shouldn't be the ones driving the change, right? So you do amazing work, but you work with a not-for-profit, or you work with another group who can take that information, put it into bigger context, and run with it. So it's more what I'm uncomfortable about is the single effort, where someone's going to go in and do a study and that will change everything, by that person suddenly being the person who's disseminating all that information and making the change. And if you're in the context of a bigger operation where your piece of data is your set of data has applicability in with other sets of data, then I have less of a problem with it. And I could see where those host-parasite relationships within bats might be very useful in a bigger picture understanding of how disease is transmitted from bats to pigs to humans or whatever. So again, it's trying to figure out the packaging of who you are and what you do so that you can fit into something that's a bigger initiative or a bigger.
And I found it hard because there's, you know, always, unless you're applying to a very, you know, niche specific grant, you know, they're asking you to kind of justify your research for a broader impact. And I don't want to do disease ecology, but I find myself putting in sentences at the end of grant applications saying this could be applied to disease ecology, and that's not somewhere that I necessarily want to go.
But you don't have to go. You can be working with other people
Right.
who take your data, and you're just saying, I'm willing to connect up with those folks. It's a problem. It's a big problem that the funders are really pushing for results in a really short period of time, and big results for small amounts of money. It's a big issue.
It's particularly the case with public funding,
Yeah.
because those different science institutions and, you know, NASA, NOAA, NIH, NSF, they're under tremendous pressure from Congress to actually demonstrate that whatever they're giving out money for is actually going to have some utility
Immediately.
in the human population. So they are, I mean, I've seen this now over decades and decades. Those institutions have really been driven in a very different direction than they once were. But, you know, think about a historical example. Okay, think about Mendel. Okay, Gregor Melnick.
Your
Okay?
favorite.
My favorite guy, as you know. Okay, so he did this research, right? Which actually took more than 35 years before anybody realized what he had actually done. Okay, can you imagine medicine, agriculture, the study of evolution, or anything without what he actually discovered? At the time that he discovered it, it wasn't related to any of that. Absolutely not related to any of it. But think about what the impact was. It's one of the greatest impacts ever in the field of science, in the fields of science. If you want to do, just your basic science work, do your basic science work. If it's really good work, you'll find the funding. You really will. And I would not get terribly distracted in other directions about how to try to prove that what you're doing is important. And those few sentences you have to put on the bottom, everything is packaging, everything is marketing, everybody has to do that. But that doesn't mean you suddenly have to run off in that direction of doing disease ecology if that's not what you really want to do. Now, if you do, or if you have someone who's interested in disease ecology that your work fits in well with, well, so much the better. But a lot of basic science is going to have very, very broad societal applications somewhere down the road. They don't have to have those broad applications now. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to do that. You really will. It's just not necessary in anything other than this kind of, what I think is more superficial marketing perspective that everybody has to do. You do it all the time. You do it 100 times during the day. You market yourself in one way or another in every interaction you have. Right?
With your family, right?
Yeah.
My twin sister said, what does my research have to do? This is serious. She actually said, ask what it had to do with recycling cans. I thought, oh, I have a long way to go to get this.
My guess is he found it.
Now, Matt, you haven't had a chance to respond. Would you like to?
Sure, just briefly, because I know we've got other things to talk about. But I absolutely agree that I'm not going to tell anybody what their moral obligation is for outreach, but completely in line with the rest of the panel on that. And I agree that you should develop some core expertise and work hard on the things that you're passionate about, and decide when you know enough to contribute, and try not to overextend yourself contributing in areas outside your expertise. There are times you should hang up on the New York Times. There are times you should decide that I have other things to do and should not get involved in this aspect of outreach. But I'm not sure I would set the bar quite as high as it sounded like Don was setting it, because sometimes there are lower stakes ways to get involved that you don't have an aggressive interviewer trying to pin you down. You just have a local partner that wants some basic guidance on who they should talk to or how they should structure something. And there are all kinds of ways to make incremental impact. Sometimes you're just spending 10 minutes on the phone with somebody, telling them what they need to know, giving them the right references or the right referrals helps have some impact in some way. And so my comment, as I was saying to undergraduates, don't underestimate your expertise, might have sounded like it was in conflict with the develop your core expertise, and until you have your, whatever research accomplishments, you shouldn't get involved in that. That might sound like conflicting advice, but I think it's partly a question of scale, how much time you'll personally put into it, how high are the stakes, whether or not this is a collaborative environment or an aggressive contested environment. And it also depends, frankly, on how you want to spend your time. I do know that a lot of people, a lot of undergraduates and graduate students that I've taught and worked with and mentored over the years, sometimes wonder, I'm putting in such long hours on work that I just don't see having impact, and I want to have a bigger impact on this planet than working hundreds or thousands of hours on a project that I don't know if it will get published, or if it gets published, how many people will read it, or what those impacts will be. And they decide that pure research science isn't for them. And that's an okay decision.
Yeah.
There are people for whom they do want to live in the life of the mind and chase questions that maybe seem abstract or don't have any real world application. But there are people that decide they want to be on the ground, doing things that affect change in the near term. And those are you could be Gregor Mendel. Maybe one of you is the next Gregor Mendel, in which case I'm glad I knew you. The whole idea that the life of the mind is the pinnacle of human accomplishment, I'm not sure I agree with that. There are all kinds of ways to make contributions outside of, the pure sciences, and everyone finds their own. What was the phrase you used? The personal motivation. You had a nice term for it. It makes your heart sing. Everyone's got different ways of making their heart sing.
I'm going to disagree with about 90% of what's been said.
Stand up for you, stand up.
The first is...
Do you want a chair?
What happened in that tenure committee, Shahid, I think is exactly what Lee Bollinger is trying to change. He's trying to value the contributions of science on the applied side and make it possible for people who contribute in that arena to get tenure and have that value. So I'm very sorry to hear that that's what happened in the committee. But that is changing. So all of you out there who do think of yourselves as wanting to have some impact with your science, don't despair. There is from what has been said here, there is a lot of demand and value, and I think increasing value in that. The other thing is, and I don't mean to sound all on a high horse about it, but it is an incredible luxury to be a scientist and take more resources from society that could be helped, that could be used in some other way. So I think it is, I'm not going to say moral imperative, but that sounds a little too extreme. But really, we do need to think very carefully about what we're doing when we have this incredible opportunity to contribute to society in some way. There are the Mendels, there's the GPS, I'm sorry, I don't know her name, but, and all of that is absolutely true. If you want to do pure science, that's great. If you want to make a contribution to the world and contribute to the many problems in the world, then think about how you can really have that impact. And the best way to have an impact is to have credibility. So the biggest thing that you have is your credibility. And there's no compromising on that. So you have to be really careful about all the standard things, maintaining your objectivity, working on issues that you know something about, all of those things that present there. So number one, have your credibility, and that's where the graduate student side comes in. You're building up your credibility, you're building up your skills, and the sort of 1% that I do agree with in what was said was that it really shouldn't be on the graduate student's shoulders to change the world.
So interestingly, I feel like it's exactly what I said. Do whatever makes your heart sing. No. I said what you should do, what your heart sings. So if you are, if you're a scientist, I think I did say I'm a scientist who I only do work that's applied.
Yeah.
So I agree with you completely that but you can do your work, and you should figure out ways that if you can do something that can be applied, then do it. But you shouldn't be forced into it. So your thought is that you should be
okay, 20%.
Okay. No, I just want to be clear.
I have to say, I don't think there's anything that you said that we contradicted.
I think we went a little too far on pure science is.
Pure science is fine if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
And applied science is fine if that's what you want to do. And quite honestly, I agree with you 1,000% that everybody is living in the lap of luxury here right now in being able to do exactly what you want to do, which 99.9999% of the people in the world are not able to do. You actually can pursue the things you want to do, which is a phenomenal luxury. I will remind you of that when you're whining sometimes. There isn't enough coffee in the urn for Tuesday seminar.
It's not that we can just do whatever we want because we want to do it. I mean, of course, there is the pure science side with the Mendels and so on, but I think we have a real responsibility to think about.
Okay, so that's the part I would not totally agree with you on, in that I don't think that everyone who wants to pursue science has a responsibility to figure out the connection between their science and some application of it.
No, I don't think that has to be a direct application.
Right.
But I think, quadrants, Caster's quadrant with the bottom quarter, which is useless and basic, that's where we don't want to be. We want to
But I don't think we can
You
ever,
don't
You can't know.
how would we ever know something is useless? That's the thing. How do we ever know something is useless? That's why I brought up Mendel's discoveries, because everyone thought it was useless.
But I don't think that's just a justification to think that we can just do whatever we want.
But so I think actually I agree with everyone else. There's really only a tiny difference here between what you're saying. I mean, my comment was about the tenure decision was that I actually feel that the pressure today is to not be allowed to do basic science because we've forgotten about all of the amazing things that has come from that line of investigation. If you think about a university, you think about most universities, if you think about where most of the funding is going, think about this university. The medical school, the law school, the business school, the School of International Public Affairs, the dental school, the engineering, the Full School of Engineering. The vast majority of universities' resources tend to go to applied research, computer science, medicine. You look at the federal funding, the total budget for ecology is like $10 million. There are people that I see here on committees, their lab gets $10 million for studying some very tiny issue in medicine. And so my concern is that I actually feel that, so my question was, isn't there a place for basic science? The only place where it seems like that's being guarded is, in fact, in arts and sciences. But then I worry that sometimes they carry that a little too far, too. Where if, because it gets back to what you have the right to do. So if this individual decided that they wanted to do something that was applied, just because they were in arts and sciences doesn't mean that they betrayed arts and sciences. But I think Bollinger is making a mistake to take this little tiny deficit-ridden community that lives elbow to elbow that's studying basic science for some of the lowest salaries on campus in some of the most marginal space, that they shouldn't be doing pure science anymore.
I agree completely with that.
Oh, then we're 100% in accord.
A place in ecology for applied science?
What's that?
A place in ecology for applied science.
Absolutely. I think most of ecology, if you think about it, is applied. Agronomy is agriculture. At the University of Minnesota, we lived in the shadow of agriculture, Borlaug Hall. We were this tiny little place. And agriculture, forestry, horticulture, these are all applied ecological, freshwater biology. A lot of civil engineering is actually applied ecology. I would say that if you go to the Ecological Society of America, this is a tiny little society. I went to the Entomological Society of America, and it was like 10 times bigger. Why? Because there you can study how to control biological pests. And so there's a lot more interest in funding that research than somebody who might be, say, studying the sexual ratio of mites that ride on the noses of hummingbirds, which is what my professor studied. Anyway, I actually feel that we forget sometimes that I would say probably 90% of the funding and the interest in this country is in applied science. Also in Google, I look at Google News because that's the news that everybody reads. And so I'm curious to see what people read. So I started I have a little spreadsheet that I keep up in the corner of my screen at home. And I look down, because they only report 4 articles per issue, per topic. There's only 4 articles for science. And I tried to keep track of how many of them were basic science. And it's really like, 2-3%. I've been doing this for a couple of years. And the public really isn't interested, except for dinosaurs. and black holes. People love black holes. But if you go to Science Daily, which has a much more comprehensive coverage, there you'll see our discipline well represented. But in the public's view, what we do is not terribly fundamental or interesting. So I think it's already that way.
Yeah, so that was just one more point and then I'll shut up. That if you do think about your work as having impact, maybe not direct impact, but somehow will apply to the real world, then what questions do we ask that people care about? If you do want to have impact, then I think we all, I'll include myself, need to think very, very hard about what questions we actually ask. And I agree with you on what you said, Eleanor, that what we think might be important might not be what other people think is important. So you can't have impact if other people don't think that what you're working on is important. And most people in this world care most about themselves and then maybe about other people sometimes. So we sometimes just go hoarse trying to convince people that what we think they should think is important should be important. But I think we, if we want to have impact, need to really think about how we reframe our messages in terms of what other people think is important, not necessarily what we think other people should think is important.
And our metrics for success, right? And,
Yeah.
and I think this is what you're starting to get at in a university setting. Is it that you publish a lot of papers no one read? Or that other people within your group read? Or that you're making a difference on the ground? And how do you measure that? So those are really critical issues that we're facing.
I can tell you a very small, humbling experience, and that is, my daughter is an editor for Health and Science at Huffington Post, so all the stuff goes through her. And she also writes. And so early on in this thing, she wrote an article that then went completely viral. And within an hour, more people had read that article than have read all of the articles I've written in fact. All. It was in an hour. So there are very different modes of communication, and those modes of communication are really, they're tapping into something very different. You know, we think, oh, you know, the New York Times or whatever. I mean, it's tapping into a very small, very, very small population. These are tapping into huge international populations, read, you know, across many, many different languages. So what you think is important may not be in that regard in terms of what the larger public thinks. So I agree with Ruth on this. And I also think it's really important for us to understand that there are a lot of people very skeptical of science and scientists, extremely skeptical of them. And it's not just in this last year of the current administration. This has been around for a while. You know, the president's plump, you know, he's mining that, but there's a lot of skepticism about it. And so that was part of what I said about bringing facts to people. They don't see those as facts, okay? And I actually sent Neha an article that I hope she'll send around to you that was in the New York Times Magazine section about a community in Eastern Oregon, and I guarantee you, you know, all the things you think are important, stuff like, you know, whether species are endangered, you know, and land use, sustainability, climate change. I mean, they've got a whole other set of facts as far as they're concerned than the facts that you would bring. And so you have to be really careful, because that's, again, I was saying, we naively think if I can just give you this information, of course you'll understand it the way I understand it. And that turns out not to be true. There are a lot of other contexts in which people are integrating that information that you're giving them. And the political context is a very, very powerful one. And there's a lot of local politics. I'm sure Ruth will tell you stories about local politics in India, and I can tell you stories about local politics in Indonesia. And you can bring all of this, and people will do something totally different. They will do something completely different from what you thought, right? For a totally different set of reasons. And you walk away scratching your head, thinking like, hey, I gave them all the right information. How did they not see it the way I saw it?
You know, one really great example of that is the fast food places. Everyone's like, oh, obesity is an issue, we should think about what we're eating. So they put calories up there, and what people do is they go in and try to figure out how many calories can I get for the least amount of money.
Right.
I kind of want to go on to what you were saying about the the politicization of science, and then also kind of go off of Ruth's comment about how the best way to make an impact is by keeping your credibility. Because there have been a lot of discussions about scientists trying to speak out to the public and speak out about their opinions. But in my own work, I am conducting a study with a nonprofit that has a particular goal in mind. So for those of you who don't know, I'm studying a type of salamander, and I'm studying how they're connected across their landscapes. But there's a pipeline that's proposed to be built across this pipeline, or across these streams. And the nonprofit that I'm working with, that Eleanor mentioned, would like to fight against this pipeline. But my results, they are what they are. However, the salamanders are connected is how they're connected. But I obviously have opinions about whether or not I want that pipeline built. I, as a person who supports conservation, doesn't want to see these habitats degraded. And so I struggle with presenting my opinion, but also keeping my objectivity, as Ruth said, and keeping my credibility. So I wanted to pose to you, how do you balance those two things I call science versus advocacy? And especially in your work, Eleanor, where you say that you do a lot of applied work.
Yeah, I mean, I said it before, and I'm going to bring it again, because I actually think there's a major difference between informed engagement and advocacy. And a lot of people sort of mix it all together, but informed engagement is what we do. We try to bring evidence to the table. We're also really careful to be not thinking that our sort of random controlled plots evidence is better than other evidence, but we try to think about ways of looking across multiple knowledge systems to bring multiple evidence to the table, and thinking about how do you assess across that, which is really complex and interesting and all about people. So for me, I try to take as clear a look at, even though I might not be supportive of these pipelines, if my data don't have anything to contribute, then I say my data don't have anything to contribute, but there are other data sources that you might need to look at for the bigger picture of this problem. But I'm not going to, obviously you wouldn't do this either, but I'm not going to pick and choose the data that help to support my position. You may not go to New York Times and say, my position supports that you can put that pipeline anywhere you want, because you really need to understand how your data fits into the bigger picture. And so again, taking a systems view, you want to look across multiple sources of data to be thinking about the decisions. So this is again why I'm sensitive to people with one piece of the equation saying, I'm going to make a difference by getting my data out there. Your data out there is great, but it's got to be put in context.
I think caution is the byword.
Yeah.
You have to have tremendous caution.
I think some of the controversy comes up because people take extremes. They feel that if you're a scientist, you must, use your authority and your position as a scientist to speak out where it matters. And there are others who say that, you shouldn't, because it actually threatens your authority and your integrity by, mixing up what could possibly be personal views without you even realizing it in the science. I think the Aldo Leopold program, we have lots of discussions about this, but the message I got most of the time was that it's just really important to know who your audience is and how you're identifying yourself. And sometimes you think they're misidentifying you, you should state that. So if you're getting up in front of Congress, you should say, I come to you to speak today as, a scientist. But if you said, I come to you to speak today as a citizen and as a scientist, or, if you say, well, if you just basically say at some point, now what I'd like to tell you is my informed opinion, then you won't get into trouble, I think, as much. Just make sure that when you're speaking, that your audience knows which hat you're wearing at the time. Again, I think there are people who feel that you should only wear one hat all the time, and you should never do scientists, because if scientists then wind up speaking from a point of advocacy, then the public will start to think that all scientists are mixing advocacy with informed information exchange, and that can wind up creating a misinformation about what it is that scientists actually do. But I'd say scientists are really quite mixed into what they think you should and shouldn't do. I certainly have met scientists who say you should never get involved with anything that involves, politics or advocacy. Always stay pure. And others who say you should.
I think I might link some of this tension back to some comments I made earlier, which is that you can contribute your data and your own science and your own core expertise, but you also have some expertise in associated fields that are not your data. But if you want to take a position, or if you want to support an organization that is pursuing a position, you can help support them with other people's data. You can help support them by enriching the dialogue with good science. And it may not be as clear cut. Sometimes people have a particular position they want to advocate for, and they're going to cherry pick, they're going to use results selectively to advocate for that position. Well, that's their moral calculus. That's their decision, and they're weighing different things to achieve different political goals. You as a scientist involved in this process can of course contribute your own science, but you also know a lot more about some of the associated fields of science than some of the people that are articulating this argument. So you being a resource to connect people to other scientific resources, other scientists, other data sets is a way to contribute as well. And that's another way to build some impact.
Can I ask a question? So, considering that we, scientists, and me and I believe we are very important in forming opinions, right? And how far do you think that scientists should be active and engaged in public policies or advocating for these sort of things? Because, for example, in Brazil, we had this very complicated issue where a new set of environmental laws was approved in 2012 that is very detrimental towards conservation, right? And it was backed mainly by the agriculture lobby. And scientists, they were vocal, however, not widely engaged. And you have discussions like the dams in Congo, that it's about to happen. So don't you think that we scientists we are not recognizing our role and responsibility on that most of the time, and not being engaged with public policies as much as we could be?
Yeah, so let me just respond, because I know that particular case, because I've worked in Brazil for many years, including through that period of time that you're talking about, when these new laws came in, the new forest laws came in. From everything I know from people who were very, very intimately involved in that process, scientists in Brazil, as well as other people from the private sector and everything, most of those decisions were not made on the basis of science. And no matter how much science you brought into that discussion, it would not have mattered. That's not what the basis of those decisions were. Okay, those were largely driven by economics, or at least the understanding of economics from, and I'll tell you something else, that when you go to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so I used to be the consulting scientist, I did it for about half a dozen countries. So I would sit with their delegations. I'd have credentials and I'd go in and sit with their delegations. They probably pretty quickly learned that I was not from Cameroon. I didn't look anything like anyone from Cameroon. But I would be on the Cameroon delegation, okay? When you look at in the case of the Brazilian delegation, you see that the group driving that was not the Ministry of Environment. It was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They were the ones there driving that. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but you have to step back and say, okay, so what exactly is going on here when it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that's driving the dialogue and debate over the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change rather than the Ministry of Environment? And there is a Ministry of Environment, a very large Ministry of Environment. To me, that just says, and I'm not from Brazil, and I would never venture into I always let my colleagues do that. I would never venture into the discussion myself as an outsider. But to me, as an outsider, I look at that and I say, something else is going on here. Okay, this is just not science. There's something else very important going on here that's driving this conversation. So I think you gave a perfect example of trying to step back and understand the complete context, like so what Eleanor was talking about, the complete context in which the science might be embedded. Right? We have this tendency to think that this kind of rational scientific view of the world, that if we just garner the right amount of information in the right way, we will convince everybody. But I think that's just not, in my limited experience over these years, that's just not what I've actually seen. And certainly not at the national level or at the international level. And at the local level, I think what Matt is saying is a very different story. The things that happen locally are much more immediate. They're going to have immediate impacts. There are constituencies that really are going to pressure the politicians to do something that won't damage their health or won't damage the environment they live in. I think at the local level, you can have a lot more impact by bringing science and scientific information. But once you start getting out to the other levels, it gets much, much harder to do.
That being said, you can gather the science on the impact of those policy decisions and share that pretty widely and have an impact. One of the things we were finding in our food ecology and globalization class last semester is that we met with people in business. And we asked them, how do they define sustainability? And they don't talk about it, but one of the metrics they were looking at was the extent to which they would get picketed, or they would have people that would call out the mistakes that they were making in terms of the labor issues or the sustainability, the environmental sustainability of their products. They're making decisions because somebody out there is bringing data to the table and then rabble-rousing about it. So there are roles that may not necessarily be at one point in time, but from a systems perspective, you can find your leverage point where bringing your data to the table and talking about it and convincing others about the efficacy of making decisions based on those data, it can make a big difference. It's just not always where you think it's going to be.
And I think it's a good point that you're making, because I think, from my experience, the private sector is going to be responsive in a way that's much more similar to local government than it is to national and international levels of whatever it is, agreements or whatever it is. And in Brazil, this was certainly the case. It was in a huge consortium of companies, the biggest companies in Brazil, that were pushing hard on trying to get the rules changed so there wouldn't be this destruction of or there wouldn't be, at least embedded in law, motivations to destroy the forest, right, to destroy the Amazon. There were a lot of extremely big companies that were very surprising, came forward to do that. And a lot of, some of it is this, what you're saying, they don't want people blaming them for having been responsible for destruction. But some of it is that they see themselves as embedded in whatever it is. They draw their products from the Amazon, and so they feel a certain level of connection to that. They want to project an image of the company itself. So companies, I'm not sure if it's true anymore, but a few years ago, they all wanted to be carbon neutral. So everybody's running around trying to buy credits and do all these other things to be carbon neutral, right? So they want to project a certain image of themselves. So I've seen a lot of responsiveness in the private sector. It doesn't mean the private sector hasn't been responsible for a lot of damage, because they certainly have. But of late, there seems to be a pretty surprising level of responsiveness in the private sector. But it has an immediate impact, as you're saying. It has immediate impact on the products they can sell, on the profits that they can share with their investors. It has that immediate, just like in local government, has an immediate impact when you're going to go run for city council. And then suddenly you have, 75 people outside your office screaming and yelling that you messed up this neighborhood because you voted for such and such, right? That can have a real effect on what you're going to do. So if you can stay at those levels, you really can have, I think, an important effect.
Well, I certainly have more questions, but I'd also like to open up to anybody else who have questions. They'd like to ask Ken. Yeah, Pooja, really quick.
Can you see me, or do you need me to get up? So I don't know if this comes under impact,
But I look at science as knowledge, and we do have a luxury. We are receiving all this knowledge. But again, I think this is very context dependent. Over here, perhaps there are there's less distinction, like socio-economic differences in society, but it's not the case in all countries. So I look at science as knowledge. And would you consider having free access to scientific literature as your impact? And I know that we also have to make money, and we have to, like everyone's can't survive without it. So is it fair that an article costs $35, which is literally the entire salary for somebody I come from India, and that is probably the entire month's salary. So I think if you can answer it from the point of view of access to knowledge more than just us doing our science and that being the thing, like knowledge of any kind, not just ecological, just any kind of knowledge, and us paying for it.
If I can just quickly say, I think it's an outrage that any scientific information has to be purchased. An absolute outrage. And particularly because the money that was used to generate that is mostly public funds. So the fact that the government, whether it's India coming through, the Institute of Science, down in Bangalore or wherever it is in India, or it's in the United States coming from, the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, they're the ones putting all the money to generate that knowledge. The fact that there are these parasitic organizations, these publishing companies that are making massive amounts of money off of information that somebody else paid to generate, it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous. It was why the Public Library of Science was formed. Because the head of the National Institutes of Health said, I can't believe I'm spending billions of dollars generating this information, and somebody else's, like Nature or Science or Elsevier or any of the other publishing companies are making huge amounts of money from this. So nobody should pay $35 or 35 cents for any of this, really.
The difficulty, though, with the open source journals is they pass on the costs to the authors.
Right.
And so when PLOS One started, there was a tremendous amount of investment in that, and there wasn't the cost. Now it's quite expensive to get, when you actually look at the cost of publication, it's not actually quite expensive, but, so I'm the editor for a journal called Science Advances, and all of its output is open access. We don't publish anything that isn't open access. But it's thousands of dollars to publish a paper in our journal. Now, if you come from a developing country, we have discounts or can even make a complete waiver if you can't pay it. But most of so Elsevier, and then now you see many of these fly-by-night journals which are popping up because they realize people will give them money to have their stuff published. And I'm not sure when we'll get the nice balance between this, but there is a cost to publishing. So Science Advances, or Science actually is a society journal, like Nature, which is a corporate journal. And so for us, we have an advisory board which consists of scientists that tell us what to do. And so financially we don't do very well. And it's a struggle actually, because the revenue's been going down, because now that we have more and more open access to the journals, and people can get it on the online libraries through the university, so you don't need to get a copy of it to put in your bag anymore. Subscriptions are going down too, and so how can we keep this up? If we keep saying we're going to pass on the charges to the authors, that's going to bring it to a close fairly soon. So right now, I've been every one of my students who've gotten a paper into a journal that they want to be open access, and then you have to pay, like Royal Society. They'll publish it, but then it'll be copyrighted. But if you want it open access, you pay up front. I've been paying for my students to have their papers published. It's a lot of money. I keep thinking that, at some point I could have had another student, right? Rather than, but on the other hand, I also recognize that professionally as well, that it's really important that their papers have wide distribution. So there's the professional dimension, as well as the sharing of knowledge, as Don said, that it is outrageous that somehow knowledge is being treated like a commodity. But there are actual real costs, and I guess because I'm an editor, I get to see the budgets every now and then, and paying for copyright and staff and office rentals in Washington, D.C., there are real costs to that. So maintaining the computers, paying for the software, when can we get rid of that? I'm not sure.
But I guess I agree with you. It's not like to publish an article is free. But I guess we have to turn that back on the government that was so outraged, or people who ran government institutions that were outraged that they were paying for science that someone else was making money on. Turn it back to them and say that in every grant that you get, they have to put a line item in that grant, just the cost of publication. I mean, we put lots of other line items in grants. That's it. There should be a line item. In fact, the government institutions and even the big private funders should demand there be a line in there. Okay, what's it going to cost? How many publications do you think you're going to get? And what do you think it's going to cost? And that becomes a line item in the budget so that you don't have to go dip into other funds to do that. And groups that are publishing aren't, living hand to mouth to actually get it published. It somehow should be a system that where we close the loop a little bit on this than what we have now. But I mean, I don't think you've ever taken a look at what some of these companies like Nature Publishing and Elsevier, what they're making. I mean, this is extraordinary amounts of money. You talk about $10 million for ecologists. They make that in a week, or even less. This has become big business, really big business. So unless they want to go and pay for the research itself, which that would be great, then they can publish it, right? But if they're not paying for the research, I don't think they should be charging for the results.
Thank you so much. It got a little heated, I honestly enjoyed. But I think my question is unfortunately to poke at that bruise again about responsibility or moral duty to practice science with impact. And I feel like a lot of your answers were with respect to a sort of vacuum for practicing the science you want without considering the current global events. And if we were in a room full of physicians and we said, how many of you want to practice emergency medicine? That's really nice, 1, 2 of you. But if we all just witnessed a car crash and we're a room of physicians and said, to what extent is each of you willing to use your ability to go and practice emergency medicine? I think the answer is really different. And so my question to you is, if that question is tempered by this burgeoning environmental crisis that we're facing, and given that those of us in this room practice a skill set highly applicable to it, is the duty greater? Because in my mind, it clearly is.
So I guess it reminds me of the lifeboat game, where you're in a lifeboat and you have to defend why you should stay on the lifeboat and why the other person should be tossed, right? And I remember going around and somebody says, well, I'm one of the world's most valued bankers, right? And it's like, boom. And then it gets to the point, and I remember always, I think Margaret Atwood had this parlor game being played. And it's sort of a really difficult thing to answer, because if you say, like when I'm working with the Millennium Villages, if I said that you want a clinic right now, and you want your school lunches, and you want better housing, you want a Jeep, you want cell phones, you want all of these things. However, I suggest if you change your practice in terms of how you're managing your soil, that 25 years from now, you'll be so grateful. It's like they say, well, I don't have 25 years. I want to solve this problem now. So then what happens is 25 years from now, the soil is degraded and things are much worse. And so it's one of these things about how do you judge the urgency? Now, in the case of the car crash that you pose as a question, the urgency is clear and immediate. This is kind of like I said, well, we need antiretroviral drugs now, right? And we can't wait till tomorrow to get them. That's the car crash. And the same thing with the lifeboat, that's an invented urgency. You've only got a few days, limited resources, who's going to survive, who's going to die? And I remember, I think it was in Margaret Atwood's book, where the person said, well, I'm a medical doctor, and was relieved because they thought, well, we're going to need a medical doctor, right? And then the person said, look, he was a minister. And so if any of you cared about this, the saving of your souls, but you better keep me on board too, because for some people the soul is really important too. And that game sort of exposed to me this real challenge that you're asking us to address, which is how do you come to grips with justifying what it is that we do in the face of this gradient from extremely urgent to trying to think over the long term, right? I think sustainability science certainly deals with that. Sustainability science has a lot of components to it, but one of them is resilience. And resilience is the idea that you're building a system that's going to last for a long time. Very often, the kind of investment it takes to do that doesn't solve your immediate problems, but it can ensure that there's less of a problem over a longer period of time. So I'm not sure that you can get a clear answer to that without, independent of the context. I think with the case of the car crash, it's very clear what the answer should be. In the case of the lifeboat, it might come to my turn and I might say I'm a community ecologist who studies the environmental consequences of biodiversity loss. It's like, boom! And I wonder actually how many of us actually would they hold on in the lifeboat because they're looking for, like, I'm a strong swimmer, or I can paddle or something. I know how to I can, rip open the jaws of a shark with my bare arms. That person might be more valued than somebody who says, I can program in R. Which here, in this room, probably has tremendous value over a 6-year time frame in a PhD. But I do think what you're talking about is actually underlies a lot of the tension and a lot of the disagreement and the complex and sometimes confused discourse we have in decision-making in environmental science.
It's also the case that if this panel were actually a group of astrophysicists, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, right? Because I do hang out with astrophysicists sometimes. And the idea that what their work is applied to anything of immediate need is laughable. We would not even be having this conversation. So they're scientists, and they're doing a lot of really extraordinary science. I mean, I am in awe of astrophysicists. That they can tell you what the chemical composition of a planet is, millions of light years away, is amazing to me, right? That they can do that. But they can convince you that they pretty much have it down, right? So they're doing extraordinary basic science, but it doesn't at the moment have any practical application. And I think it's, I think it's pretty phenomenal science, right? It's because, we have the option, right? That's the luxury, right? We have the option to do the basic science. We have the option to apply the basic science to larger societal problems, or at least the ones we define as larger societal problems. And we have the option to try to then take our science and bring it in various forums to see whether we could get it integrated into policy. Right? I do all three of those. I publish on all three of those. I do all three of those. So I haven't felt that it's an either or. If I do basic science, then I can't do applied science. I've never felt that. I mean, I do basic science. This last year, I published some basic science stuff. I published some applied science. Right? So I've never really felt that. And I also brought a lot of things to policy forums. So I'm not sure it's an either or that we all have to, in this room, everyone has to walk out of here having decided which side they're on. I think they actually could do both, or all of the above, whatever it is. But I have to agree with Shahid here because what we might decide now is of absolute urgency. We might temper that or alter that or completely change it, 5 years from now, of what we think is of absolute urgency. So I'm not sure we want to use that necessarily to color exactly what we're going to do. Give ourselves some more degrees of freedom.
I wanted to follow up on that, if I could, on just a story which I find a lot of things amusing, and sometimes I have to catch myself because people are thinking, why is he laughing? But so I was at the NSF panel, and at the end of it, we realized that 1.7% of the proposals were going to get funded. So out of 200 proposals, less than 4 were going to get funded, right? But at the end of serving on an NSF panel, they usually have the big shot, whose name I forgot, who comes in and gives a pep talk. And they just basically go to every panel and thank you for your service, and they give you a pep talk. And he wanted to say how, as the head of the NSF, I've forgotten his name, and it's probably good since I'm being recorded, that he wanted to give an example how fantastic the National Science Foundation was. And I'm sitting here realizing that we just had about $10 million worth of funding that was going to basically fund 1.7% of it. And one of the things that's really distressing about an NSF panel is you read fantastic proposals, because people tend to send proposals when they've got great ideas and great data. They're not sending you crap and hoping they might get lucky, right? So we're trying to decide between like very, very good and excellent, and it's like it's the ones with all the excellence by chance wind up getting funded, and then only a fraction of those. So he says that we spent $500 million trying to detect a gravity wave, and they failed utterly, right? And so you know what? They threw another $500 million at it, and by golly, the second time they found it, and it was so exciting, and it was in all of the newspapers and whatnot. And I was sitting there, and I actually said this, but I was worried that I'd be perceived as some sort of ecological Luddite, not aware of the importance of what this research was. And I said, but you just told us that, the great thing about NSF is that it's agnostic about the kind of science. They put the money where they think the most excitement was. And I said, I don't think anybody was in doubt that gravity existed. I also didn't think that there were any competing theories about gravity. This was entirely confirmatory science. They just simply want to complete our understanding of the standard model, and the gravity wave has been extremely difficult to demonstrate. But there is no competition. There's nobody else that's saying, no, it's not because of that, it's because of this. And so I said, so nobody was actually questioning whether it existed. There was no competing hypothesis about whether there was or wasn't a gravity wave. Because if you found out that you didn't find a gravity wave, you said, well, we better throw another $500 million at it because we know it's out there, right? And so I said, I think you're creating this self-fulfilling prophecy, in that you only give us $10 million, and then you look at what we've done over the space of the last year, and you say, well, you haven't done very much, but then you're super impressed by the fact that you detected a gravity wave. Now, here's the flip side of that I had to deal with, and I think all of you do as well. The public loves what NASA does. They're super excited. This gets back to the Google News. They're super excited that we now have discovered exoplanets in another galaxy. I felt that the excitement and energy about the exoplanets in our own galaxy was over the top. Now we're like, look at another galaxy. I think it takes 3 billion light years to get to that other galaxy. And so it's like, if we don't find a planet to live in this galaxy, well, we just need to go another 3 billion years. Mind you, life itself was 3.5 billion years old. So we could evolve the Earth all over again by the time we got there, to find out that this galaxy was dominated by the Empire anyway.
If we extrapolate the
So this is the dilemma. Science, as Don said, science is publicly funded, and so knowledge should be given to everybody, because it is actually part of our taxes, right? On the other hand, NASA has a huge budget. People love what they do. Now, I'm not sure if it's because the physicists have gotten them excited about it, and we have failed to get them excited about it, or if it's just actually something that's, intrinsically more interesting, if you believe in intrinsic sort of, understanding. I have to say that when I've done cafe science and paired with an astronomer, I lose. Because I try to give a very upbeat, cheery, full of jokes and make people laugh about mass extinction and the death of the world as we know it. And but then and then they get up and talk about, is there intelligent life in the universe? This is true, David Helfand. And the audience is like leaning forward and wanting to know the answer. The second thing is he gets all these questions that are related to what he talked about. I kid you not, the questions that I get asked about, what do you think about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, you know? What about, you know, climate change? Is it a scientific conspiracy? You know, and it's like, I was just talking about mass extinction. They think because I'm an ecologist, I have opinions on just about anything that has to do with it. I was asked about androgen mimics in the water. I thought, I'm talking about biodiversity loss here. So in a way, the public is really interested in funding so much of ecology that actually isn't what we do in this room so much. So here's this thing, we want to serve the public and they fund us. On the other hand, you know, I don't know at what point your ability or willingness to communicate or interact at local scales or large scales can somehow get the public to see that everything we're doing is as interesting as knowing whether gravity exists or not. And perhaps a bit more. Sorry for the tirade. Anyway.
But I mean, that also explains why NIH is so much bigger than NSF.
Yeah. Or military funding is something.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at the kinds of diseases that get the biggest funding in NIH, they are the diseases that congressmen and women are afraid they're going to suffer from. The diseases of age, right? That's what they're funding. I mean, even if you look like in cancer, you look at the specific cancers that are being funded, it's the ones they're really afraid that they're going to go to the doctor one day and someone's going to say you have, and they're hoping there's going to be like an immediate fix, right? So, yeah, I mean, I've been looking at the budget of NIH compared to NSF. I mean, it's like, it's a many, many multiples.
Claire, if I can address your question directly. If you see the conservation or environmental biology equivalent of a car crash, and you want to engage at whatever level you care to and the skills that you have, you should engage. And we all should. And in some ways, I think it's an interesting question you put, who wants to go into emergency medicine versus who wants to help in an immediate sense. Now, the car crash is such a visceral experience that I think even the non-medical doctors here would go to that, hey, is there something I can do to help? Because it's so immediate that I don't know that, I'm not sure it's like quite the right metaphor for how to get engaged in, whether it's environmental change or sustainability or biodiversity loss. But to the extent that I think what we all said at the outset, and maybe this was maybe one of the bigger points of contention with Ruth, is we didn't want to say that everybody had to do this.
I'm not saying everybody has to. I'm saying
yeah. But I think that the faculty that are in the room right now all have decided to work at least partly in the applied sphere. And your point that wouldn't be true if this was in the astrophysics field is absolutely right. And so as much as we didn't come down and preach that everyone has to go out and do this all the time, my guess is that we all do it because we think it's important, and many of you are probably going to do this to some extent because you think it's important. And the question is how to you've only got so many hours in the day, you've only got so much mental energy, you can only put yourself into so many things. Try and decide how many of them to do in the immediate short-term local, here's a return on that investment, versus I need to continue to work on this because this has some longer term or larger scale impact. And it's hard to know the answer. Did Mendel do so much of his work because he was really just curious about these things? I don't think he thought he was setting a foundation for how we understand life on Earth, century after his work. Of course he wasn't. He couldn't have any idea that he was doing. And none of us can ever know how exactly the work that we're doing this afternoon is going to impact, at all the different scales. So it's hard to know how to tell people how to act in that sense, except to some extent to trust your gut and to do what you feel you should do. And to the extent that we have an obligation, because we live a life of relative privilege, and people have invested in us, our families, the educational system, the time, the resources that have gone into training us to get to this point, we have an obligation to do good with that. But how we do that good depends so much on your personal circumstance, your skill sets, your attitudes, your position in life, in terms of who's your employer and what are you paid to do and what is your job security and how far a field can you go and still be considered to be, producing for the things that support who you are? That's such a complicated calculus that there is no one set of answers to it. I think we should all be helping at the car crash. I think we should all be, when you realize you can have a positive impact on something, to take that opportunity. But it's hard to cast aspersions on the people who haven't, because you don't know if they're in different circumstances and have skills that are better suited toward longer term solutions or things that aren't as immediately and directly applicable.
On that note, I know that we've run far over time, but thank you again.
It's still 10 to 9. I have no idea for overtime.
Thank you so much for sitting here and giving us the time to talk about how to make